Hey everybody, it's Skye Schooley here, staff writer with business.com. Today I'm joined by Sarah Rowell, the CEO of a leader in e-learning workplace solutions, Kantola. Today we're talking about what workplace harassment looks like in the remote workplace and how employers can mitigate it. So it's no surprise that many employees around the world are working remotely, but just because people are working from home as opposed to in office doesn't mean that workplace harassment has just suddenly disappeared. Can you tell us what constitutes as workplace harassment and give us some examples of what that might look like in a remote workplace?
It's true. Harassment, hasn't disappeared just because we've moved more remote. Harassment is unwelcome conduct in the workplace that's based on a protected characteristic. And so these protected characteristics include things like race, religion, sex, among other things. So really anything that's harassment in a physical workplace is also harassment in a remote work setting. But as you asked for, let's work through some examples of how that might manifest itself. So one common form of harassment is inappropriate jokes in the workplace that make other work colleagues feel uncomfortable. So that can be in a physical working space. That could be you're in a meeting or some other kind of event and the jokes are told and people feel uncomfortable. Let's think about how this might move itself. So if you're on a video conference, you can tell the very same jokes. If you're on a conference call, those very same jokes can be told as well. But let's think about some of the other remote working tools, like an increased use of instant messaging systems and emails. That can also be a different forum or a different media to share things like inappropriate pictures. And in fact, sometimes the jokes can escalate a little bit further when you're in this kind of remote setting. So it's the same, it's just manifesting itself in a different way. So if I take maybe another example, which isn't actually harassment, but that of bullying or abusive conduct, this may not touch on protected characteristics, so it may not truly be harassment, but some of the impacts, the negative impacts on individuals of bullying are just as deep. And so this is typically maybe where you might find that someone's targeting one specific colleague with particularly harsh comments, maybe unproductive ones that aren't really designed to kind of improve working, and it's done in front of other people. And this is another area where we're finding it can actually become even more problematic in a remote work setting, because often things are being done on like channels of instant message channels, etc. So again, same thing manifesting itself in different ways. It's essentially, like I say, it's the same, but there is one thing that's different, and that's that more of these channels, they're more likely to leave a trace. So you might have a video recording, you might have it on an instant message channel, or it might be an email chain. So that's just something that's kind of important to think about in this new world that we're living in.
Definitely. And I think you had kind of touched on this, but how has remote work affected harassment specifically? How has it impacted the way that employees are harassing each other? Is it all just kind of the same, just done on video, or are there some changes that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there have been changes. I think, this last year, it's not just remote working, it's remote working under very specific circumstances. We've been kind of plunged into this. And so I think one of the first areas are these kind of blurred lines between personal and professional. And I think in some ways, that's not all a bad thing, right? You can bring your authentic self to work. I think anyone who works with me has now met my children multiple times because they love to join my video conferences. And that's okay. People can get to know me on a different level, and I think there's positive things around that. At the same time, it can open a window into someone's life that maybe they weren't ready for. And so personal comments, personal questions can start to happen, which make people feel a bit uncomfortable. I think the second area are there's increased anxiety and isolation, and that can cause problems. When someone is feeling anxious, they're feeling stressed, often this can amplify tension within a work relationship. And so that can maybe increase that sharpness that can happen in terms of maybe abusive conduct and bullying. I think there's also been a creep into what working hours look like. They stretch longer, and people send messages at times without perhaps thinking of the impact on the other side. And so it can lead to a feeling on the other side of feeling, if not fully harassed, certainly under pressure. And then I think the third area is what I like to kind of refer to as reduced guardrails. So there are fewer bystanders, and bystanders are really good at deflecting. So, they can de-escalate situations, they can give feedback to somebody, really they're kind of spotting something in their early warning signals. If others in the room seem to feel like things are a little uncomfortable, you're maybe not getting that degree of feedback. And also, because we're not in person, we are relying more on sending messages and other things like that. And you're not getting those those visual cues and feedback from people about how are your comments landing. So it's different. I think it is starting to feel different. And as a result, in workplaces, we just need to think differently about how we talk about it, and how we protect ourselves against it.
And what are microaggressions in the remote workplace? And how do those contribute to a less equitable and less inclusive workplace?
So microaggressions, it's a very wide range of exclusionary behaviors, and they're not always micro, so that can be a little misleading. It's a kind of a catch-all phrase for insults and slurs and slights and other kinds of demeaning behaviors that can happen toward individuals from traditionally marginalized groups. So that's kind of really the grouping of how that is. There's lots of different ways to categorize it. I won't get into lots of jargon. I'll try and keep it more straightforward. There's those direct and obvious ones where someone is using a piece of somebody's identity against them. So what we like to do is interview lots of people so we can keep current on what are people's experiences in the workplace like. And so if I think about an interview that I did recently, with somebody who uses a wheelchair, and that's part of her identity, and she was working on an important project that didn't have anything to do with the fact that she uses a wheelchair, but one of her colleagues really didn't want this change and started to use that piece of her identity as a way to try and stop the change from happening. And she was left then feeling like she was defending herself rather than moving forward with the work. So that's kind of, one category that's very direct. It's really quite obvious, actually. But then we have other ones which are maybe less obvious. Maybe the motive is less clear. So another very common example of this that we hear time and again is lots of intrusive questions. And asking people questions about their identity is not always a bad thing. It's the way that we learn, and it's the way that we engage with each other. I think it's how or the context. So if you have no other relationship with this person and you haven't built a period of trust, to then just pepper them with questions about what it's like to be fill in the blank, it becomes very it feels very difficult on the other side without the other person really understanding or meaning to have that impact on them. And then another one that's very subtle is negating the experience of a person. So again, thinking about a specific example, there was an individual that we spoke with who felt that a lot of people made assumptions about their level of education based on their identity, which didn't actually match with reality, but it made them feel very invalidated, and it was just kind of harder for them, knowing they weren't sure what people were thinking as they were moving through their workplace. So those are some of the categories and kind of what it actually means. I mean, I always like to kind of use a simple analogy to explain why they're so difficult, and why it makes it really hard for people. Imagine you're running a race and you're just running the race. That's fine. You run away, you do your very best job. Imagine instead, though, you're running the race and people are throwing kind of crumpled up paper cups at you. It's very distracting. It's distracting physically. It's distracting mentally, because you're wondering, why are they throwing paper cups at me? So you can't do your best. You can't run your best race. And that's really kind of what the impact of it looks like.
Very interesting. So we know that workplace harassment is bad. What can employers do to mitigate that in their workplace? What steps can they take to reduce that from happening, particularly with remote workers?
Out of the difficulty of being plunged into new ways of working, there always comes some upsides. And this is a really good time to focus. So it may be that you've actually been working remotely for a while, and now you're thinking about transitioning to hybrid work. These sorts of changes are a really good time to reassess. And so I would say you need to start with your values and your company culture, and not the one that you want, but the one that you actually have, and match that with kind of where is that gap and how can you address that gap. So I always think that starts with listening, and then it starts with dialogue. And culture is never shaped by one person, it's always a group effort. So increasing that level of intentionality around having those conversations. It's also a really good time to review your policies, because policies may have been written years ago and they didn't really take into account some of these things. So think about your workforce and how it's changing, and that may need to reassess your policy. And then, of course, you will need to socialize that. I also think if you're going to do that, that is a great time to think about training, launching training or relaunching training, because that's where you're going to get some attention, because people will have felt that change as they really want to understand what does it mean. And then finally, and I think it links back to the first one, which is you can't address anything unless you track it. And the only real way to track it is to make sure that you're finding easy mechanisms and creating safe spaces for people to be able to tell you if things aren't working well. So particularly in a remote working setting, you don't have those easy bump into each other kind of conversations. So I think it's really important for leaders and kind of managers to open up the chain of conversation. And that's really not to say, oh, I meet with my people a lot. Well, do you meet with them in a space where it's just an open question? How are things going for you? How is remote working for you? Just kind of understand what's happening. And so I think all of that kind of together will kind of help you get on the right track. It's very daunting. I not only do I do this sort of thing as a profession, but I also run a business, and it is daunting. But I think for me, there's always that safe place to start, which is start by listening and start by increasing dialogue. And from there, I think some of those steps will present themselves.
Fantastic. And I love that you actually touched on training, because that leads nicely into what I was going to ask next. Is why is harassment training so important for employees, even if it's not legally required for employers to provide?
As you know, harassment training is increasingly becoming required, but there's loads of reasons to do it, even if you're not required to do it in your state or your industry. The first one, from a company perspective, I guess is going to sound the most self-serving. It's to reduce that company liability, right? So it's to say, hey, we create a space where we told everybody clearly what's expected and what's not expected. And so if you've done that, it's very clear you've made lots of good attempts, you've made proactive steps to try to create that safe environment where everybody really understands expectations. But actually, the great thing is that actually really does impact something that's very real, and that's reducing that risky behavior. I think there's always been some doubt around the impact of training, and I think you have to really think carefully about how you're implementing your training and what you're implementing. But it really does improve those risky behaviors. Why? Well, it's not just about saying to the harasser, hey, and they will amend their behaviors. It's about creating an ecosystem that can spot it. People know how, when they maybe are feeling harassed, they have the words and the language to be able to express themselves. Bystanders, know what to do. Managers are aware of their responsibilities. They're aware of what they can do. So it's kind of got that great ability to actually fundamentally change how people interact with each other. And then finally, and it's related to above, it creates a more proactive and intentional culture that has so many different benefits, spillover benefits. And what I like to say is, your choice of what you say to your employee on the topic of harassment is really your voice about this. And so they're going to listen and say, oh, this is what my employer thinks about this topic. It's hard to have a voice if you're not training people. Training can mean many different things, but it's hard to have a voice around what you're saying about these things. So I think it creates that. I think it creates not just a retention and a positivity and a one team feel. I think that actually also helps you attract talent, and it can even help your brand on the marketplace. So I think it does require investment. People always think about that part of things, but it does have returns. And I had a conversation with a client who has been investing quite significantly in this for about the last 4 or 5 years. And during that time period, she's seen about a halving of incidents that have happened in our company. And yes, reporting has gone up at various times during, because as you tell people how to report, they will report. But it has a long-term impact where everybody starts to understand, how should we be behaving together? We can be close, but we don't have to harass. We don't have to make people feel uncomfortable.
I love it. And lastly, when employers are looking for a training program, what type of features should they be looking for when selecting one?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think one basic one, really should be deep and verified expertise. this is a topic that's fairly complex and it's got fairly complex needs. And actually it's getting more complex in the US as different states are requiring different things. So you really want to look for somebody who understands that, not just can give you something that you need today, but has the ability to maintain that and change as requirements change. And so things like endorsements are a good way to do that, and just think about track record and really understand what kind of investment levels people are putting in to maintain what they're working on. I think the other one is you have to think about implementation. So training is only as good as having everybody take it and complete it. And so you have to think about that challenge. You're not talking about just a course. You're thinking about how does the course get to everybody? And how do we make sure everybody takes it? And then when it comes time for the challenge of doing it all over again, because it's a bit of rinse and repeat, how can I make that really straightforward as well? So that's not just features. I think there's technical features for e-learning companies. I think there's other features for people who do their training in different ways. But it's also about the team and the people who'll be there to support you in doing all of that, making as your workforce changes will help you through that change. And then I think obviously you have to look at the quality of the course itself. So my area of expertise is more on e-learning, so I can kind of speak more to that. But I think these very same principles apply. We're not talking about whizzy bling bling kind of training. Instead, you want to think about training that's really engaging and is based on adult learning principles. So a real way to do that is the main way to do that is scenario-based training or story-based training that allows for discovery learning. So where the learner themselves are discovering the insights and the learnings, not being told. And what that does is it really increases the chance that it will change behavior and that people will retain the information afterwards. So look for the quality of the story that's being told, but also look for how is that story being used to actually change behaviors. A story is just a story. You might as well go and watch Netflix if you want that, which I personally love, but training is that bit different. And then I think the final one on this topic would be to look for a partner. So see, is somebody actually going to understand you, understand your specific needs as a company? Every company is different. And will they say, I want to listen. I want to hear what your learners have to say. I will amend my training if I get good feedback. I want to learn how your business evolves, and I want to support you as you grow and change. So I think all of those things are what you should probably look for.
Awesome. Well, that was all that we had for today. Thank you, Sarah, so much for joining us. And thank you guys for watching at home or at work, wherever you are. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in more business related content, subscribe to our channel.